Wilson Pickett, a man and a half. Hi there, welcome back to this week's edition of The Greatest Record Ever Made. I'm Carl Caffarelli, the co-host of This is Rock and Roll Radio with Dana and Carl, heard every Sunday night from 9 to midnight, right here in Syracuse on Spark, WSPJ 103.3, 93.7 FM, and on the web at sparksyracuse.org. I am also a writer, and I'm working on a book called The Greatest Record Ever Made, Volume 1, dedicated to the notion that an infinite number of songs can each be the greatest record ever made as long as they take turns. This week's greatest record ever made spotlight falls on the wicked Pickett, Wilson Pickett, and his 1965 hit recording of In the Midnight Hour. I'm already on record as saying that I regard 1965 as the greatest year in pop music history. I think 65 stands out like no other year does. 1966 is also great. 66 is almost as wonderful as 65, but there's something about 65 where the great stuff was popular and the popular stuff was great. I don't think any year can quite match 1965's batting average, if you will. I mean, from the Beatles to James Brown to Love and Spoonful to all the stuff coming out of Motown to just everything. The hit records were fascinating. Every number one hit in 1965 was at least pretty good, if not great, fantastic, greatest record ever made, whatever you want to say. 66 is awfully close. In 1966, if I had to actually pick one record as the greatest record ever made, one song, it's a record that was released in 1966. We'll get to that eventually in this series. Perhaps the greatest album of all time, The Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, was also released in 66. So there's lots of great stuff to say about 1966, but I give the crown overall to 1965. That's not necessarily driven by nostalgia, or at least not firsthand nostalgia. I was 5 years old in 1965, and I certainly remember little bits of the pop music that was around then. I remember the Beatles, for God's sakes, for sure. Everyone knew the Beatles. It didn't matter how old you were, young or old, everyone knew the Beatles. And I heard all this stuff on the radio, but I didn't really get that appreciation for the magic of 1965 until many years later when I started as a teenager in the mid-70s, started looking back at the inspiration that the 60s provided for me. And that's a touchstone that's never gone away and never will go away. I did not know Wilson Pickett's In the Midnight Hour at all. I didn't know Wilson Pickett at all, really. My introduction to the song In the Midnight Hour was, oddly enough, a group called Cross Country, I think it was Cross Country, had a number 30 hit with a cover of the song in 1973, and that was getting airplay on AM radio in Syracuse, WOLF AM and WNDR AM. A very, very white bread version of it, but that's where I first knew the song from. I would hear a better version before too long. Wilson Pickett did a couple of other songs, did a number of other songs that should be considered among the greatest soul records, pop records ever made. Of all things, his cover of the Archies' Sugar Sugar was, I'm pretty sure, the first Wilson Pickett song ever played on This Is Rock and Roll Radio, very early in our run, 22 years ago, on This Is Rock and Roll Radio. And I like the Archies. I'm not just putting the Archies down. I'm an unapologetic fan of the Archies. I'm an unapologetic fan of bubblegum music. I won't rule out the Archies getting a spot in the greatest record ever made book before I'm done, because it's not carved in stone yet. But what Wilson Pickett does with Sugar Sugar is just miraculous, almost alchemy, except that I do like the original. I think Sugar Sugar is a fine pop song. In Pickett's hands, it is something wholly other. Pickett's version of the Cannibal and the Headhunters hit Land of a Thousand Dances. Na 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 na. I call upon President Biden to issue an executive order and make that our national anthem instead of the Star Spangled Banner. Because couldn't you just see when we're able to go to ball games again, going to see a baseball game and the announcer asking you, please rise for our national anthem. I said, na 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 USA. There's a great live clip somewhere on YouTube. Just find it. You're smart people. Of Pickett doing Land of a Thousand Dances at I have no idea where it was or when it was. I think it's late 60s, early 70s, I'm going to guess. And he's just riveting. It's just fascinating to watch him hypnotize the crowd. In that clip, he is as great a live performer as James Brown, as Elvis Presley, as Otis Redding, better than Mick Jagger. And I love the Stones. So I'm not That's not faint praise. Pickett is in that category. In the Midnight Hour is my favorite. And this is what I have to say about it in the book's chapter about In the Midnight Hour by Wilson Pickett. Sometimes, even a great record, the greatest record, is taken for granted. For all the classic 45s or album tracks that tackled you and gloriously pinned you to the pavement on first exposure, there are many other shots of sonic bliss that you just didn't quite get immediately. Songs you didn't fully appreciate on first spin or third spin, or even for a long while after that. Maybe some of these are records you initially deemed merely, okay, I guess, if you gave them any thought at all. Perhaps some are little ditties you ignored or even actively disliked. And then one day or night, preferably night, you hear the song again. And it suddenly clicks, as if you're hearing it for the first time. And it's like the trite old story of the presumably mousy secretary whose beauty suddenly reveals itself when she removes her glasses. Except that she was always beautiful, with or without the glasses, you freaking dimwit. You just didn't notice. But you're paying attention now. And whether it's a girl, or a song, or some other sublime gem, you've fallen in love. What took you so long? I never disliked Wilson Pickett's In the Midnight Hour. But it wasn't at the top of my pop consciousness either. My first active memory of the track was a TV commercial for an oldies compilation sometime in the mid-70s. The cathode ray figure of the wicked Pickett himself, swaying and simmering as he lip-synced that he was going to wait till the midnight hour, jumped from my TV screen and filled my room with bravado and soul. It was so cool. And the indelible memory of that image makes me smile, even now. It should have been the start of a beautiful obsession. The moment slipped away instead. I didn't give the song much further thought for years thereafter. Those years passed, like teardrops flowing under a bridge. I had moved to Buffalo in the early 80s. By 1984, I was engaged to the love of my life. We had gotten rid of our intrepid 1969 Chevy Impala and replaced it with an awful 78 Mercury Bobcat that was far and away the worst car we ever owned. That crappy little Bobcat's only advantages over the Impala were that it didn't stall out quite as much. It had power steering, and it had an FM radio. I remember approximately where and when I was. It must have been 1984, maybe 85, no later, probably not earlier. I don't recall ever catching an oldies show on the Impala's AM radio, so I must have been in the verdamped Bobcat. I'm not sure where I was driving from, but I know I was heading east on Route 5, away from Williamsville, or fresh off the thruway, passing the Lord Amherst Hotel on my way home to our Lisbon Avenue tenement apartment. It was, I think, a Saturday night. It's always Saturday night whenever great oldies play on the radio. And the song played. The Memphis horns flooded my sorry little jalopy with the sound of soul, and Stax Records' mighty session players, guitarist Steve Cropper, bassist Donald Duck Dunn, and drummer Al Jackson joined forces with the horns to form an offensive line of dominant, confident strut like nothing I'd ever experienced. But if I thought that was swagger, and I did, it was nothing compared to the sheer self-assured groove of Wilson Pickett wailing his lustful vow. I'm going to wait till the midnight hour. That's when my love comes tumbling down. I'm going to wait till the midnight hour when there's no one else around. This was a pure and pristine spell, even while it looked forward to the sweaty, shaken consummation of earthy love as the clock strikes 12. I'm going to take you, girl, and hold you. Do all the things I told you in the midnight hour. It was the gospel of sex. A testifying moan. A celestial mingling of heaven and earthly desire. Sin as salvation. Nearer, my God, to thee, all night long, in the midnight hour. It's inconceivable to think that I didn't hear Wilson Pickett's In the Midnight Hour at least once in that decade or so that elapsed, in between a snippet in a TV commercial and a Saturday night drive in my little Bobcat. I must have heard it, probably many times. But I didn't really hear until that night. That moment, when the wicked, wicked Pickett preached in sacred tones of a midnight meeting between the sheets. Swagger. Soul. This suburban white kid's world expanded in an instant, albeit an instant that was years in the making. That's a lot of midnight hours. That's a lot of swagger. And that's the greatest record ever made. Amen. Again and again, baby. The sweetest sacrament can be wicked indeed. Thank you for joining me this week on the greatest record ever made. Next week, the spotlight falls to the Hollies, and I Can't Let Go. Below, you will see options to support, to subscribe, to tip. And I will also put a link to the published version of this chapter in the book. I think there's a couple of words different. That's pretty close to how it's going to appear in the book. I thank you for joining me, whether it's the midnight hour or not.